Chapter 24, Section 4, The Second New Deal. To meet the challenges from the right and left, Franklin Roosevelt took to the airwaves once again. In a June 1934 fireside chat, he asked Americans to judge the New Deal's progress by the plain facts of your individual situation. Are you better off than you were last year? The response of most Americans was loud and clear. In the November 1934 congressional elections, Democrats gained a large number of seats in both the House and the Senate. The huge Democratic victory encouraged FDR. In 1935, he began introducing another flurry of legislation. In part to counter the demagogues, FDR shifted his focus away from recovery and towards social and economic reforms. He aimed to provide Americans with relief, stability, and security. Many historians call this second round of programs the Second New Deal, energizing the country with electricity and jobs. In the spring of 1935, Congress passed FDR's Emergency Relief Appropriations Bill. FDR called it the Big Bill because it created several new agencies and called for nearly $5 billion in new spending, an unprecedented increase. One of the new agencies was the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA. In 1935, fewer than 20% of American farms had electricity. The REA established hundreds of publicly owned electrical cooperatives, built generating plants, and strung power lines. When it completed its work, about 90% of the country's farms had access to cheap power. The Big Bill also spawned a huge agency called the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. The WPA, a work relief organization, put more than 3 million Americans to work in its first year. They built hundreds of thousands of bridges, public buildings, and parks. At the urging of Eleanor Roosevelt, the WPA also established arts projects. It hired unemployed artists to paint murals in public buildings. Musicians combed the American backcountry to find and record folk music. Writers created guidebooks to the states. The WPA generated a lot of controversy. Many conservatives denounced the program's cost, while labor unions attacked it for depressing wage rates. Despite the criticisms, the program continually expanded. By 1936, the WPA employed 7% of the American workforce. The Supreme Court attacks the New Deal. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court had begun weighing in on key New Deal programs. In 1935, in the case Schechter Poultry Corp. v. United States, it struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act. The court ruled that the act violated the constitutional separation of powers by giving the president, rather than Congress, the power to issue codes of fair competition to businesses. The next year, the court killed the Agricultural Adjustment Act on the grounds that the law to regulate and control agricultural production was a matter beyond the powers delegated to the federal government. It also struck down a New York law setting a minimum wage for workers. Roosevelt fumed that the court had created a no man's land where no government, state, or federal could act effectively. A Bill of Rights for Workers. Despite the court's rulings, FDR continued to push for reform legislation. A month after the Supreme Court declared the NIRA unconstitutional, Congress passed a new bill to protect workers. The National Labor Relations Act, also called the Wagner Act for the senator who sponsored it, came to be seen as a Bill of Rights for organized labor. The Wagner Act guaranteed workers the right to self-organization, to form, join, or assist labor organizations, and to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing. To protect these rights, the Act created the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB. This board had the power to supervise union elections to ensure that they were free and democratic. It could also penalize employers for unfair labor practices, such as attempting to discourage workers from joining or forming a union. Congress passed a related bill in 1938. The Fair Labor Standards Act regulated conditions in the workplace. It also set a minimum wage of 25 cents an hour and a maximum 44-hour workweek for most workers. In addition, the act banned oppressive child labor. Together, the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act met many of the long-standing demands of American workers and promised to make their lives more secure. Economic security for Americans. FDR also addressed the long-term problems of the aged and unemployed. Among our objectives, he told Congress in January 1935, I place the security of the men, women, and children of the nation first. Later that month, FDR revealed his landmark Social Security Act. Congress passed the bill in June, and in August, the president signed it into law. At the signing ceremony, FDR said, We can never ensure 100% of the population against 100% of the hazards and vicissitudes, unexpected changes, of life. But we've tried to frame a law which will give some measure of protection to the average citizen and to his family against the loss of a job and against poverty-ridden old age. Franklin Roosevelt, August 14, 1935. The Social Security Act created a social insurance program that provides two main types of benefits: retirement and disability. Retirement benefits are cash payments made to retired workers sometime after they reach the age of 62. This is the program most often associated with Social Security today. The government finances these payments by taxing current workers and their employers. Disability benefits are payments made to workers who have become too disabled to continue working, regardless of their age. Severely disabled children are eligible for Social Security disability benefits as well. The Social Security Act also set up an unemployment insurance program for workers. This program makes payments to people who've lost their jobs and are seeking new work. Its funding comes from taxes on employers. Usually, unemployment benefits last for up to 6 months. However, Congress has sometimes extended benefits for longer periods during economic recessions. Battling the Supreme Court. In 1936, FDR won a second term as president with a landslide victory. He viewed this victory as a mandate, a grant of authority, to extend the New Deal further. But FDR feared that the Supreme Court would continue to block his efforts. By then, several court decisions had threatened his attempts to give government a greater role in stabilizing the economy and society. FDR's frustration led him to take a controversial step. In 1937, FDR presented Congress with legislation to redesign the Supreme Court. The bill called for adding a new justice for every sitting justice over age 70. FDR claimed that the court was behind in its work, partly because aging justices could not keep up. But his real intention was clear. He wanted to pack the Supreme Court with liberal justices who would favor New Deal programs. Republicans and Democrats alike expressed outrage at FDR's court-packing plan. So did the American people. Congress rejected the bill. Around this time, the Supreme Court shifted course, becoming more accepting of government regulation of the economy. In 1937, the court upheld both the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act. In these decisions, the court redefined its understanding of liberty. Conservatives, backed by the court, had long equated liberty with the freedom of private enterprise to act without government interference. Chief Justice Charles Evan Hughes observed that there was no constitutional basis for this narrow definition. In fact, he said, the Constitution supported a broader definition of liberty that included the protection of law against the evils which menace the health, safety, morals, and welfare of the people. That is, government could promote liberty by using its powers to ensure fair treatment of all Americans.